The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and despair, a sterile cage where dreams went to die. At 24, Ezra Martinez lay in a bed that felt like a coffin, his body a traitor, ravaged by a rare neurological disease doctors could only name, not cure. 6 months, they'd said, their voices clinical, their eyes avoiding his, as if his fading life was already a footnote in their charts. But Ezra wasn't ready to be a footnote. Not yet. Not when the world still held colors he hadn't painted, songs he hadn't sung, and a love he hadn't found. He stared out the window of the San Francisco hospital, the Golden Gate Bridge a distant blur through the fog, and whispered to himself, "I'm not done." That's when he heard the knock. Not the polite tap of a nurse or the hesitant shuffle of his worried mother, but a bold, rhythmic knock that demanded attention. The door swung open, and there stood Julian Carter, all broad shoulders and disheveled curls, his paramedic uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. His hazel eyes locked onto Ezra's with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, warmer. "You're the guy who keeps breaking the hospital's heart monitors, huh?" Julian said, his voice carrying a playful lilt that didn't match the sterile surroundings. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the linoleum, and Ezra felt something stir in his chest, a spark, defiant and alive. "I'm Ezra," he managed, his voice weaker than he wanted, but steady enough to hold Julian's gaze. "And I'm not breaking anything. They just can't keep up with me." Julian laughed, a sound like summer breaking through winter, and in that moment, Ezra forgot the 4 in his arm, the beeping machines, the ticking clock. For the first time in months, he felt seen, not as a patient, but as a person. Over the next week, Julian became a constant. He'd slip into Ezra's room after his shifts, bringing contraband coffee or stories from the ambulance, tales of chaos, and hope that made Ezra laugh until his sides ached. Julian was 26, a transplant from Atlanta with a drawl that softened his words and a past he only hinted at, something about a family that didn't understand him. Ezra didn't push. He was too busy memorizing the way Julian's hands moved when he talked, strong but gentle, like they could hold the world together. One night, as rain lashed the hospital windows, Julian pulled a chair close to Ezra's bed. "You ever think about what you'd do if you had one perfect day?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Ezra's breath caught. He'd spent months avoiding that question, terrified of its weight. But Julian's eyes, steady and warm, made it safe to answer. "I'd go to the ocean," Ezra said. "Feel the salt on my skin, hear the waves. I'd paint it, every shade of blue and gray, so I could keep it forever." Julian leaned closer, his hand brushing Ezra's. "Then let's make it happen." The words were a promise, reckless and bold, and Ezra felt his heart race, not from fear, but from possibility. Julian didn't see a dying man. He saw a fighter, and for the first time, Ezra believed he could be one. The next morning, Julian arrived with a plan. "We're busting you out," he said, grinning like he'd just cracked a code. Ezra's doctors protested. His condition was unstable, his immune system weak, but Julian had a way of charming the impossible into reality. By noon, Ezra was discharged for a day trip, strapped into a wheelchair with a blanket over his legs, Julian pushing him toward a beat-up van parked outside. They drove south, the city giving way to the rugged cliffs of Big Sur. Ezra's body ached, his muscles weak from months of immobility, but the sight of the Pacific unfolding before them was a balm. Julian parked near a lookout point, the air thick with salt and pine. He helped Ezra out, steadying him as they stood on a cliff, the wind tugging at their clothes. "Look at that," Julian whispered, his arm around Ezra's waist. The ocean stretched endless and wild, a canvas of blues and grays that matched Ezra's dream. He wanted to paint it, to capture this moment. but his hands trembled too much to hold a brush. Instead, he leaned into Julian, feeling the warmth of his body, the steadiness of his presence. "You're not just a paramedic," Ezra said, his voice soft but sure. "You're a miracle." Julian's laugh was quiet, almost shy. "Nah, I'm just a guy who knows a good thing when he sees it." They stood there as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in fire and gold. Julian's hand found Ezra's, their fingers lacing together, and for a moment, the world was just them, two souls defying time, defying fate. Ezra didn't know if he had 6 months or 6 days, but he knew this. Julian Carter was his reason to fight. As night fell, they sat in the van, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories under the stars. Julian spoke of his childhood in Georgia, of a father who called his dreams unnatural, of years spent hiding who he was. Ezra shared his own battles, growing up Latino in a conservative town, finding solace in art, only to have his future stolen by a diagnosis. Their truths wove together, raw and unfiltered, binding them closer. "I don't care what the doctors say," Julian said, his voice fierce. "You're not going anywhere. Not without me." Ezra's eyes stung, but he smiled. "You're going to have to keep up, then." They laughed, and Julian pulled him close, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of salt and hope. It was a vow, unspoken but unbreakable. They'd face whatever came, together. But the world doesn't pause for love. Back at the hospital, Ezra's condition worsened. His legs grew weaker, his vision blurred at the edges. The doctors doubled down on their prognosis, their voices colder now, as if hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Julian, though, was undeterred. He spent every free moment with Ezra, sneaking in sketchpads, playing music, planning impossible futures. One evening, as Ezra struggled to hold a pencil, Julian knelt beside him. "You don't need to paint to create something beautiful," he said. "You're doing it right now, just by being you." Ezra's chest tightened, not from pain, but from the weight of love he hadn't expected to find. He wanted to believe Julian, to believe in a future where they could build a life. But doubt crept in, a shadow he couldn't shake. What if he was holding Julian back? What if love wasn't enough? The hospital became both a prison and a sanctuary. Ezra's days blurred into cycles of tests, treatments, and Julian's visits, each moment with him a rebellion against the ticking clock. But the shadow of doubt grew heavier, whispering that love, no matter how fierce, couldn't rewrite his fate. Julian sensed it. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the window, he sat on the edge of Ezra's bed, his hands fidgeting. "You're pulling away," he said, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "Why?" Ezra looked away, his throat tight. "You deserve more than this," he said, gesturing to the IVs, the monitors. "You're young, Julian. You should be out there, living, not tethered to a guy who might not make it to next spring." Julian's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare decide what I deserve," he said, his voice low but fierce. "I'm here because I want to be. Because you're worth it." The words hit like a wave, washing away some of Ezra's fear, but not all of it. He wanted to believe Julian, to cling to the promise of forever, but his body was a constant reminder of how fragile that promise was. Still, Julian didn't waver. He brought Ezra a small canvas and paints, setting them up on a tray table. "Paint something for me," he said. "Anything." Ezra's hands shook, but he tried. The brush felt foreign, his strokes clumsy, but Julian's presence steadied him. He painted the cliff from Big Sur, the ocean wild and free, and in the corner, 2 figures, small but unmistakable, holding each other against the world. When he finished, Julian's eyes glistened. "That's us," he said. "That's forever." Their bond deepened, but the world outside wasn't as kind. Julian's family, still in Georgia, found out about Ezra through a cousin who'd seen them together on social media. A tense phone call followed, Julian's voice rising as he defended his life, his love. "I'm not hiding anymore," he told his father, his words echoing through the hospital room. When he hung up, his hands were shaking, but his resolve was iron. Ezra reached for him, their fingers intertwining. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "You didn't," Julian said, his voice soft but sure. "You make me braver." They clung to each other, finding strength in shared vulnerability. But the hospital wasn't a bubble they could stay in forever. Ezra's condition stabilized enough for him to be discharged to a rehab facility in Oakland, a place with more freedom but no less uncertainty. Julian rented a small apartment nearby, juggling his paramedic shifts with visits, determined to be part of Ezra's recovery. The rehab facility was a mix of hope and frustration. Ezra worked with physical therapists, pushing his body to reclaim what it had lost. Some days, he could walk a few steps with a cane. Others, he could barely sit up. Julian was there through it all, celebrating the victories and holding him through the setbacks. They'd sit in the facility's garden, surrounded by blooming jasmine, and talk about dreams, a house by the sea, a gallery for Ezra's art, a life where love was enough. But love, as fierce as it was, couldn't stop the disease's slow march. One night, Ezra woke gasping, his vision swimming, his limbs unresponsive. Julian, who'd fallen asleep in a chair beside him, was at his side in an instant, calling for help. The doctors stabilized him, but the episode was a stark reminder. Time was not their ally. Julian refused to let despair win. He started researching clinical trials, contacting specialists, pouring his energy into finding a way to give Ezra more time. One evening, he burst into the room, eyes alight with hope. "There's a trial in Seattle," he said, waving a stack of papers. "It's experimental, but it's promising. They're looking for patients like you." Ezra's heart raced, not just from hope, but from the sight of Julian's unwavering belief. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Then we try something else," Julian said, his hand cupping Ezra's face. "I'm not giving up on you. Ever." The decision wasn't easy. The trial meant leaving California, uprooting their fragile routine, and facing the unknown. But Julian's conviction was infectious, and Ezra agreed. They packed light, Julian's van carrying them north through misty forests and coastal towns. In Seattle, they settled into a small rented room near the research hospital, a space filled with Ezra's sketches and Julian's playlists, a makeshift home built on love. The trial was grueling. Ezra endured endless tests, infusions that left him weak, and nights where pain kept him awake. Julian was his anchor, holding his hand through the worst of it, singing softly when words weren't enough. Slowly, impossibly, Ezra started to feel stronger. His vision cleared, his tremors lessened. The doctors were cautious, but their words held a new note: hope. One evening, as they walked through a Seattle park, cherry blossoms falling like snow, Ezra stopped. "You're my miracle," he said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "I don't know how much time we have, but I want every second of it with you." Julian pulled him close, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a vow renewed. "Forever," he whispered. "I promised you forever." Seattle's rain was relentless, but to Ezra, it was a symphony, each drop a reminder that he was still here, still fighting. The clinical trial was a gamble, but 6 months in, the results were undeniable. His symptoms were stabilizing, his strength returning. He could walk short distances without a cane, paint without his hands shaking. The doctors called it a cautious success, but to Ezra and Julian, it was a miracle carved from stubborn hope. Their life in Seattle settled into a rhythm. Julian found work as a paramedic, his shifts long, but his spirit unbreakable. Ezra spent his days in a small art studio they'd rented, a cramped space filled with canvases, and the smell of turpentine. He painted the ocean, the cliffs, Julian's eyes, every moment they'd shared, every promise they'd made. His art became a testament to their love, a way to hold on to the life they were building. But miracles are fragile, and doubt lingered like a shadow. Ezra's progress was real, but the disease was still there, dormant but not defeated. At night, when Julian slept beside him, Ezra would lie awake, wondering if he was borrowing time, if he was asking too much of the man who'd given him everything. One evening, as they sat on their tiny balcony overlooking the Puget Sound, Ezra voiced his fear. "What if this is as good as it gets?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if I relapse, and you're stuck watching me fade again?" Julian set down his coffee, his eyes fierce. "Then I'll hold you through it," he said. "I didn't sign up for easy, Ezra. I signed up for you." The words were a lifeline, but they couldn't erase the tension building in Ezra's chest. He loved Julian too much to let him sacrifice everything. He started researching, late at night when Julian was at work, looking for answers, new treatments, support groups, anything to give them more control over their future. He found a community center in Seattle, a haven for queer people facing chronic illnesses, and joined a support group. There, he met others like him, people fighting not just for survival, but for joy, for love, for a life that mattered. The group became his anchor, a place to share his fears without burdening Julian. He learned to navigate his illness with a new kind of strength, one rooted in community and resilience. But he also saw the toll it took on partners, the quiet sacrifices, the moments of despair. It made him question whether he could ask Julian to carry that weight forever. One night, after a group meeting, Ezra came home to find Julian cooking, the small kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and basil. "You're late," Julian teased, but his smile faded when he saw Ezra's expression. "What's wrong?" Ezra took a breath, steeling himself. "I love you," he said, "but I need to know you're choosing this. Us, for you, not just for me. I don't want you to stay out of pity." Julian's face fell, but he stepped closer, his hands framing Ezra's face. "Pity? Ezra, you're the strongest person I know. I'm here because you make every day better, because I can't imagine a life without you." The words broke something in Ezra, a wall he'd built to protect them both. He pulled Julian into a kiss, fierce and desperate, as if he could pour all his love, all his fear, into that single moment. They held each other as the rain fell outside, a promise reaffirmed in the quiet of their tiny home. But life, as always, had other plans. Julian's father, still bitter from their last call, showed up unannounced, his presence like a storm cloud. He stood in their doorway, his face a mask of disapproval. "This isn't you," he told Julian, his voice cold. "You're throwing your life away for this." Ezra's heart sank, but Julian didn't flinch. "This is my life," he said, his voice steady. "And Ezra's the best part of it. If you can't see that, you don't know me." The confrontation left Julian shaken, but it also clarified something for both of them. Their love was a choice, one they'd make again and again, no matter who stood in their way. Ezra's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for them. The trial continued, and Ezra's health held steady. He started exhibiting his art at local galleries, small shows that drew crowds of strangers who saw their own stories in his paintings. Julian was there for every opening, beaming with pride, his hand never leaving Ezra's. They were building something real, something lasting, but the specter of relapse loomed, a reminder that love alone couldn't conquer everything. One evening, as they walked through Pike Place Market, the air alive with the scent of flowers and fish, Julian stopped at a small jewelry stall. He picked up a simple silver ring, turning it over in his hands. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes intense. Ezra's breath caught. "I think you're trouble," he said, grinning, but his heart was racing. They didn't buy the ring. Not yet, but the moment lingered, a quiet promise of a future they both wanted. 2 years after that first cliffside moment in Big Sur, Ezra stood in a small gallery in Seattle, his paintings lining the walls. The room buzzed with people, their voices a hum of admiration, but Ezra's eyes were on Julian, standing across the room, his smile brighter than the gallery lights. The trial had worked better than anyone expected. Ezra's disease was in remission, a fragile victory that gave them time, if not certainty. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still bad days, when Ezra's body betrayed him, when fear crept in. But Julian was there, always, with a joke, a touch, a reminder that they were in this together. They'd moved into a small house near the water, a place filled with Ezra's art and Julian's music, a home built on love and resilience. That night, after the gallery closed, they walked to the waterfront, the city sparkling around them. Julian stopped, pulling Ezra close. "I've got something for you," he said, his voice nervous but sure. He pulled out a small box, revealing the silver ring from the market, now engraved with a single word, "Forever." Ezra's eyes filled with tears, but he laughed, the sound bright and free. "You're really doing this, huh?" "Damn right," Julian said, slipping the ring onto Ezra's finger. "I promised you forever, and I meant it." They kissed, the world fading to just them, the water lapping softly nearby. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was a vow, a commitment to face whatever came, together. Ezra thought of the doctors who'd said he had no future, of the fear that had once defined him. They were wrong. His future was here, in Julian's arms, in the life they were building, one moment at a time. The community center became their second home, a place where they volunteered, helping others navigate the challenges of illness and identity. Ezra's art inspired, Julian's stories uplifted, and together, they became a beacon for those who felt lost. They faced prejudice, from strangers and sometimes family, but their love was a shield, unbreakable and fierce. One spring morning, they returned to Big Sur, standing on the same cliff where it all began. The ocean was as wild as ever, the sky a canvas of possibility. Ezra held Julian's hand, the ring glinting in the sunlight. "I used to think I was running out of time," he said, "but you gave me forever." Julian smiled, his eyes soft. "We gave it to each other." They stood there, wrapped in each other, the wind carrying their laughter. The future wasn't certain. Disease, prejudice, life itself could still challenge them. But they'd learned something vital. Love doesn't erase pain, but it makes it bearable. It makes it beautiful. Ezra painted that moment later, a canvas of blues and golds, two figures against the sea, their hands entwined. He titled it Forever, a testament to a promise kept, a life reclaimed. The doctors had been wrong. Ezra's future wasn't a diagnosis. It was Julian. It was art. It was every moment they chose to fight for. And as they faced the years ahead, they did so together, knowing that forever wasn't a guarantee. It was a choice, one they'd make every day, with every breath, for as long as they had.